December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Beneath a steel-grey sky that promised more snow, Lieutenant Sarah May Coleman pressed her back against the frost-covered wall of a field hospital tent, feeling the canvas shudder with each distant artillery concussion rolling across the frozen hills. At 28 years old, she had crossed an ocean and fought through mountains of military bureaucracy to serve her country, only to spend most of her deployment organizing medical supplies in the rear echelon, while white nurses handled actual patient care. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd graduated top of her nursing class at Howard University, completed advanced trauma training at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, and still spent her days counting bandages while wounded men arrived by the truckload from the front lines. What Sarah didn't know, as she inventoried plasma bottles that bitter morning with frost-numbed fingers and aching feet, was that within 72 hours, she would rewrite the rules of military medicine and force an entire field hospital to confront everything they believed about courage, competence, and the color of healing hands. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel and allows us to keep bringing you these important historical narratives. This is the untold account of how one woman's refusal to accept limits transformed not just lives, but the very structure of military nursing during World War II. It's a story of 200 souls who survived because prejudice finally met something stronger than itself. A story of how excellence under fire can change hearts that peaceful persuasion never could touch, never could reach, never could truly transform. Sarah May Coleman had been counting, not just supplies, but days. 63 days since the 77th Field Hospital had established operations in Belgium, setting up their canvas city in a clearing surrounded by pine forests that reminded her strangely of the woods behind her childhood home. 63 days of watching ambulances arrive in convoys, hearing the cries of wounded soldiers carried on the cold wind, and being politely but firmly redirected to infantry duties whenever she approached the surgical tents where the real work happened. The head nurse, Captain Margaret Henderson, always had the same reasoning ready, delivered in that crisp Boston accent that made everything sound rational even when it wasn't. The men are more comfortable with nurses they're familiar with, she'd say, her smile thin and tight. Or we need someone reliable managing supplies, someone who won't get flustered under pressure. Always delivered with that barely masked subtext that Sarah had learned to read in the faces of white authority figures since childhood. Sarah had learned to swallow her frustration the way she'd learned to swallow so many things. She'd grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood where the streets had no names, only numbers, where black families lived in houses that never quite seemed solid enough to withstand the next storm. Her father, Reverend James Coleman, had been a minister at the 16th Street Baptist Church, a man who preached patience and dignity even as segregation pressed down on their community like a physical weight. He'd taught Sarah something important on the day she left for nursing school, standing on the platform of the colored waiting room at the train station. "The fight isn't won by anger, baby girl," he'd told her, his calloused hands gripping her shoulders. "It's won by being so undeniably excellent that denial becomes absurd. Be so good at what you do that they can't ignore you, can't dismiss you, can't pretend you don't deserve to be there." So Sarah had made herself excellent. She memorized every medication dosage, every surgical procedure, every treatment protocol in the thick medical textbooks she studied by kerosene lamplight. She practiced suturing techniques on leather scraps her father brought from the shoe repair shop. She learned anatomy by drawing diagrams until her fingers cramped, and she waited for her chance to prove herself. The hospital compound consisted of 8 large tents arranged in a rough square, with smaller supply tents scattered around the perimeter like satellites orbiting a central hub. Each tent served a specific purpose: receiving and triage, 2 surgical tents, post-operative recovery, medical ward for non-surgical cases, supply and pharmacy, mess and administration, and quarters for the medical staff. At peak capacity, they could handle 150 patients, though during heavy operations that number often swelled to 200 or more, with soldiers lying on stretchers in the spaces between tents, in the narrow pathways, anywhere there was room to lay a wounded man down. The surgical staff included 6 doctors, ranging in age from the youngest at 29 to the oldest at 52, 18 nurses, and roughly 40 medics and orderlies who handled everything from changing bandages to carrying stretchers to assisting in surgeries when extra hands were desperately needed. Among those 18 nurses, Sarah was the only one who wasn't white, a fact that was never mentioned directly, but hung in the air of every interaction like smoke that never quite dispersed, always present, even when invisible. She shared a tent with 3 other nurses: Lieutenant Patricia Morrison from Boston, a sharp-featured woman with ice-blue eyes who'd studied at Massachusetts General; Lieutenant Helen Kowalski from Chicago, soft-spoken and anxious to please; and Lieutenant Ruth Barker from somewhere in rural Texas, who didn't hide her opinions about anything. Patricia was cordial but distant, treating Sarah with the kind of careful politeness you'd give a stranger at a formal dinner. Helen tried to be friendly, in a way that somehow made things worse, asking questions about Sarah's hair and family, with an earnest curiosity that felt invasive. Ruth didn't bother with pretense. "You know they only let colored nurses into the service because of politics," Ruth had said one evening, about 3 weeks into their deployment, not even lowering her voice as she cleaned her boots by candlelight. "It's not about qualification. It's about Roosevelt trying to please certain voting blocs back home, trying to make the coloreds feel included so they'll keep voting Democrat." Sarah had continued reading her medical journal, an article about new techniques for treating sucking chest wounds, not giving Ruth the satisfaction of a response. But the words had stung as they were meant to, because underneath the anger she felt at Ruth's casual cruelty was a terrible question. What if Ruth was right? What if she was only here because of politics, because of quotas, because of pressure from the NADACP and other civil rights organizations? What if she never got a chance to prove that she belonged here on her own merit? The morning of December 19th started like any other cold, miserable morning in Belgium, the kind of morning that made soldiers question why they'd ever left home. Sarah woke before dawn, as she always did, her body's internal clock refusing to adjust to the luxury of sleeping past 5 in the morning. She pulled herself from dreams of warm Alabama summers, dreams of her mother's kitchen and Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house, into the frigid reality of a tent that smelled of canvas and unwashed bodies, and the peculiar metallic scent of Army-issue wool blankets that never quite seemed clean no matter how often they were aired out. She dressed in her olive drab uniform, buttoning each button with the precision she brought to everything, and made her way to the supply tent through ankle-deep snow that crunched beneath her boots. The temperature hovered around 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and her breath formed clouds in the frigid air that hung motionless in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd been reassigned to inventory duty again, which meant checking and rechecking supplies that had already been checked twice before. It was make work, and everyone knew it. But Sarah approached it with the same meticulous attention she gave to everything else. If they were going to judge her more harshly than white nurses, she'd make sure they never found a legitimate reason to criticize. But that morning something was different. The usual distant rumble of artillery, which had become such a constant presence that she barely noticed it anymore, had grown closer, more insistent, like thunder rolling in before a summer storm. Around 0800 hours, just as Sarah was completing her 3rd count of morphine syrettes, Captain William Bradford, the hospital's commanding officer, called an emergency meeting. Sarah wasn't invited to these meetings, of course, but she could hear the raised voices from her position near the supply tent, voices carrying across the compound in the cold, still air. "Major German offensive," someone said, the words sharp with alarm. "Breakthrough in our lines, multiple divisions pushing through the Ardennes." The words filtered through the canvas walls, each one more alarming than the last, painting a picture of catastrophe unfolding somewhere to the east. By mid-morning, the first casualties began arriving, and it quickly became clear that this was unlike anything the hospital had experienced before. Not the usual trickle of wounded from patrol skirmishes and artillery exchanges, but a flood, a torrent of broken bodies that seemed to have no end. Ambulances and trucks appeared in rapid succession, churning through the snow, each one carrying its cargo of broken bodies and the smell of blood and cordite and fear. Sarah watched from the supply area as nurses rushed between tents, their white aprons quickly turning red, their faces tight with stress. The surgical teams worked at a frantic pace, but it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. The wounded kept coming, kept coming, kept coming. Around noon, Captain Henderson appeared at the supply tent entrance, her normally immaculate uniform disheveled, her carefully pinned hair beginning to escape its pins. She looked at Sarah for a long moment, and Sarah could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, could see pride warring with desperate necessity, could see the exact moment when necessity won. Finally, Henderson spoke, her voice tight but controlled. "Lieutenant Coleman, we need every available hand. Report to Triage Tent 2 immediately." Sarah felt her heart accelerate, felt adrenaline surge through her veins, but she kept her voice steady and professional. "Yes, ma'am." She grabbed her medical kit, checked that she had her scissors and hemostats and stethoscope, and followed Henderson into the chaos. Triage Tent 2 was a vision of organized pandemonium, a scene that would have seemed impossible if Sarah hadn't been standing in the middle of it. Wounded soldiers lay on every available surface, some on canvas cots, others on stretchers, a few directly on the ground atop blankets that were rapidly soaking through with blood. The air was thick with groans and urgent voices, and the coppery smell of blood mixing with the antiseptic smell of alcohol and iodine. A young captain with a clipboard was attempting to sort patients by severity, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Critical here," he shouted, pointing to the left side of the tent with a hand that shook slightly. "Stable cases to the right. Move, move, move. We've got more coming in every minute." Sarah immediately began working, her hands moving with the automatic precision of years of training finally being put to use, assessing wounds with the efficiency she'd practiced in her mind 1,000 times, but never been allowed to demonstrate in reality. Her first patient was a private who couldn't have been more than 19 years old, his face still bearing traces of teenage softness beneath the grime and blood, probably lying about his age, to enlist like so many boys did. He had significant trauma to his left leg, the trousers torn away to reveal a wound that made Sarah's stomach clench, despite her training, and all the medical textbooks she'd studied. The field dressing was soaked through, dark red against the pale skin, and his face had that grey pallor that signaled dangerous blood loss, the colour of old newspaper left out in the rain. Sarah checked his pulse with 2 fingers against his wrist, finding it thin and rapid, a bird's heartbeat, then examined the wound more closely. The leg needed immediate surgical attention, but the operating tents were already full, the sounds of urgent voices and clanging instruments spilling out into the cold air. She applied a fresh tourniquet, her fingers working the strap with practiced efficiency, elevated the limb to reduce blood flow to the damaged area, and started a plasma line, finding the vein on the first try despite the soldier's collapsed vasculature. The private looked up at her through pain-glazed eyes, confusion mixing with the agony. "Are you really a nurse?" he managed to ask, his voice weak and thready. His surprise would have been insulting if Sarah hadn't been so focused on keeping him alive, on stopping the bleeding and stabilizing his pressure and making sure he survived the next hour. "I really am," she replied calmly, her voice carrying the soothing authority she'd learned from watching the best nurses at Friedman's Hospital. "And you're going to be fine. I promise you're going to be fine." She moved to the next patient, then the next, falling into the rhythm of emergency medicine, the rhythm she'd dreamed of for so long. Check airway, make sure they're breathing. Check breathing, make sure the lungs are expanding. Check circulation, make sure the heart is pumping blood to where it needs to go. Stop bleeding, stabilize, move to the next one. She'd dreamed of this moment, of finally using her training for its intended purpose, but the reality was more intense than any dream could capture. The sheer volume of casualties was overwhelming, a tide of human suffering that threatened to drown them all. For every soldier she stabilized, 2 more arrived, carried in on stretchers or walking with help from their buddies, all of them needing immediate attention. By 1400 hours, Sarah had treated more patients than in her entire previous deployment combined. Her uniform was spattered with blood. Her arms ached from the constant physical labor of lifting and moving and working, and she hadn't eaten since dawn. Her stomach was a tight knot of hunger and adrenaline, but she felt more alive, more purposeful than she had in months. This was what she'd trained for. This was why she'd endured the insults and the doubts and the endless inventory duty. A young medic approached her, his face pale and frightened, carrying a soldier with both hands wrapped in bloody bandages that were dripping onto the ground. "This one's bad, ma'am," the medic said, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "I don't know what to do. I've never seen anything like this." Sarah examined the hands quickly but thoroughly, unwrapping the bandages to reveal severe lacerations across both palms, possible tendon damage, definitely nerve involvement, but manageable if treated properly and quickly. She talked the medic through the process of cleaning and dressing the wounds, her voice calm and instructive, watching to make sure he understood each step. "Clean the wound thoroughly," she explained. "Check for foreign bodies. Apply sulfur powder to prevent infection. Bandage firmly but not so tight that you cut off circulation." The medic listened with desperate attention, his hands steadying as he followed her instructions, and Sarah realized he was learning from her, actually learning, with no concern about her race or background, or whether she really deserved to be there. In crisis, competence was the only thing that mattered. Results were the only currency that had value. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still the wounded kept arriving in an endless stream. Sarah learned from the talk around her that the German forces had launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes, a bold and desperate gamble that had caught Allied forces completely by surprise. The breakthrough had been devastating, punching holes through American lines that had been considered secure just days before. American units were falling back in disarray, fighting rearguard actions as they retreated toward more defensible positions. The field hospital, originally positioned well behind what everyone had thought were stable front lines, now found itself uncomfortably close to the advancing enemy, close enough that they could hear the distinctive sound of German artillery, different somehow from American guns. Captain Bradford made the decision to continue operations, believing that evacuation would cost more lives than it saved, that moving patients in their current condition would be a death sentence for many. "We stay until we can't stay anymore," he announced to the assembled staff. "Every man we stabilize here is a life saved. Every hour we buy them is another hour for their bodies to recover. Where stay?" As darkness fell, bringing with it a cold that seemed to penetrate straight through clothing and skin to freeze the bones, Sarah was reassigned to Surgical Tent 1. The lead surgeon, Major Robert Henshaw, was a stern, precise man from Philadelphia who'd barely acknowledged Sarah's existence during her 2 months at the hospital. He was known for his exacting standards and his short temper with anyone who couldn't keep up with his pace. Now he looked at her with frank assessment as she entered the tent, his eyes taking in the blood on her uniform, the exhaustion on her face, the steady competence in her movements. "You're the nurse from supply," he said. Not quite a question. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze directly. Henshaw gestured to the surgical table, where a soldier lay unconscious, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity under anesthesia. "Then scrub in," he said. "I need someone who can anticipate my needs and keep up with my pace. Let's see if you can do that." What followed was the most intense 4 hours of Sarah's life. Major Henshaw was indeed precise, but he was also extraordinarily fast, his hands moving with a speed that seemed impossible, given the delicacy of the work. He performed procedures in half the time Sarah had seen other surgeons take, and he demanded absolute focus from his team, tolerating no hesitation, no uncertainty, no wasted motion. Sarah found herself falling into sync with his rhythm, handing him instruments before he asked for them, adjusting retractors to give him the exact angle he needed, monitoring vital signs with one part of her mind, while the other part stayed completely focused on the surgery. The patient, a sergeant with internal injuries from shrapnel, survived the surgery. As they were closing, Henshaw spoke without looking up from his sutures, his voice conversational despite the tension of the work. "Where did you train, Lieutenant?" "Howard University, sir," Sarah replied, her hands steady as she held the tissue for him, "and then advanced trauma training at Freedman's Hospital in Washington." Henshaw grunted, a sound that might have been approval. "You have excellent hands," he said, steady, no wasted motion. "Good instincts about what I'll need next. Why haven't I seen you in surgery before now?" Before Sarah could answer, before she could figure out how to explain 2 months of inventory duty without sounding bitter, Captain Henderson's voice came from the tent entrance. "Major Henshaw, we have 7 more critical cases waiting. The Major is working on 1, but we need every surgeon we have." Henshaw sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Then we keep working," he said. "Coleman, you're with me for the duration, however long that turns out to be." The duration turned out to be all night and into the next morning. Sarah worked alongside Henshaw through case after case, learning his techniques, matching his intensity, pushing past exhaustion into a state of focused clarity where nothing existed except the next stitch, the next clamp, the next life to save. Around midnight, a young lieutenant was brought in with a piece of shrapnel lodged dangerously close to his heart, so close that Sarah could see it moving slightly with each beat when they opened his chest. The surgery required absolute precision, and Sarah found herself holding retractors at an exact angle for over an hour, while Henshaw worked to extract the fragment without causing fatal bleeding. Her arms trembled with fatigue, muscles screaming in protest, but she didn't waver, didn't let the retractors shift even a millimeter. When Henshaw finally removed the metal and the soldier's vital signs remained stable, the major looked at Sarah with something approaching respect, maybe even admiration. "That was good work, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "Very good work. Better than most nurses I've worked with, and I've worked with a lot of nurses." By dawn on December 20th, Sarah had assisted in 14 major surgeries, more than she'd assisted in during her entire time in medical school. She'd also trained 3 younger nurses in advanced wound care techniques, showing them how to pack wounds properly, how to identify damaged arteries, how to maintain sterile technique even in the chaos of a field hospital. She'd organized a more efficient system for tracking patients through triage, using colored tags to indicate priority level so nurses didn't have to keep checking charts. The hospital had processed over 300 casualties in 24 hours, far beyond their normal capacity, and somehow they'd kept pace. And Sarah had been at the center of it all, proving with every suture and every saved life that excellence couldn't be denied. But the crisis was far from over. The German advance continued through the 20th, and by mid-morning, enemy forces were reported just 10 kilometers from the hospital's position, close enough that the sound of small arms fire was clearly audible during quiet moments. Captain Bradford called another emergency meeting, this one with all senior staff, including the chief surgical nurse. Sarah, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced, was cleaning instruments when she heard her name called. "Lieutenant Coleman, report to the command tent immediately." She entered to find Bradford, Henshaw, Henderson, and several other officers gathered around a map spread across a folding table. Bradford looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between respect and apprehension. "Lieutenant, we have a situation," he said without preamble. "There are approximately 200 wounded soldiers at an aid station 15 kilometers northeast of here. The aid station was established 3 days ago to handle casualties from the initial fighting. Now that aid station is behind enemy lines due to the German breakthrough. They've requested evacuation, but we don't have enough ambulances to move that many men quickly, and the route is under active fire from German positions." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anticipation and dread. She knew what was coming before Bradford said it. "We need someone to lead a medical team to stabilize those men so they can survive until evacuation is possible," Bradford continued, his voice heavy. "It's dangerous. Very dangerous. The team would be operating in a hostile zone with minimal protection. We can spare 1 infantry squad for security, but they'll be badly outnumbered if they encounter significant enemy forces. Major Henshaw has volunteered to go, and he's specifically requested you as his chief surgical nurse." Sarah's mind raced, weighing the danger against the need, thinking about 200 wounded soldiers who would die without help. She looked at Henshaw, who met her gaze steadily, his expression serious. "I need someone I can rely on absolutely," Henshaw said. "Someone who won't panic under pressure, who can work through chaos, who can make good decisions independently. In the last 24 hours, you've proven you're that person. I want you with me." Captain Henderson spoke up, her voice tight with something that might have been concern or might have been something else. "Sir, perhaps one of the more experienced nurses would be more appropriate for such a dangerous mission. Someone who's worked in combat conditions before." Major Henshaw interrupted her, his voice sharp. "With respect, Captain, I've worked with every nurse in this hospital over the past 2 months. Lieutenant Coleman is the most technically proficient surgical nurse I've seen in 15 years of practice. Her suturing is cleaner than mine. Her triage decisions are sound. Her ability to work under pressure is exceptional. If I'm going into a combat zone, I want the best nurse available, and that's her." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah saw Henderson's face flush, saw the other officers exchanging glances that ranged from surprise to approval. Bradford looked directly at Sarah, his eyes searching her face. "Lieutenant Coleman, do you accept this assignment?" Every eye in the tent was on her. Sarah thought about her father's words spoken on that train platform so long ago. Be so undeniably excellent that denial becomes absurd. She thought about the 200 soldiers who would die without help, who were lying in pain and fear behind enemy lines. She thought about every barrier she'd faced, every doubt that had been expressed, every time someone had dismissed her capabilities. Then she stood straighter, squaring her shoulders. "Yes, sir," she said clearly. "I accept the assignment." The preparation was rapid and thorough. The team would consist of Major Henshaw, Sarah, 2 other nurses who volunteered, Patricia Morrison and Helen Kowalski, both of whom looked terrified but determined, 4 medics, and a squad of 12 infantry soldiers for security led by Sergeant Marcus Riley, a grizzled veteran from Tennessee with 3 combat tours. They would travel in 3 ambulances and 1 supply truck, carrying as much medical equipment as they could fit, along with extra ammunition for the infantry. The route was roughly 30 kilometers round trip, through territory that was now contested, where neither side had clear control. Intelligence reports indicated German units were in the area, though exact positions were unknown. The mission would take most of the day if everything went well. If things went badly, well, no one wanted to think about that. Before departure, Sarah wrote a quick letter to her parents, her handwriting shaky from exhaustion and nerves. She didn't mention the danger, didn't tell them she was about to drive into a combat zone, only that she was finally doing the work she'd trained for, finally using her skills to save lives. "If you're reading this, I'm living my purpose," she wrote. "I'm doing exactly what I was meant to do. That's all any of us can ask for in this life." She sealed the envelope and left it with the chaplain, Father O'Brien, a kind-faced man from Boston who promised to mail it if she didn't return. When she came back, he corrected gently. When, not if. Sarah appreciated the optimism, even if she couldn't quite share it. The convoy departed at 1400 hours on December 20th, rolling out of the hospital compound into the frozen landscape beyond. Sarah rode in the lead ambulance with Major Henshaw and 2 medics, watching the scenery pass through the small window. The landscape was bleak and beautiful in equal measure, rolling hills covered in pristine snow, forests of dark pines standing like sentinels, occasional burned-out vehicles marking where earlier fighting had occurred, their metal skeletons black against the white ground. They saw no one for the first hour, which somehow made it more tense. The silence felt ominous, like the pause before a thunderstorm breaks. Around 1500 hours, they heard it. The distant crack of rifle fire, sharp and clear in the cold air, then the heavier thump of artillery deep enough to feel in the chest. The convoy slowed, and Sergeant Riley came forward from his position in the security vehicle. "That's coming from about 5 kilometers ahead," he said grimly, his weathered face serious. "Right where we're headed, most likely." Henshaw looked at Sarah, perhaps giving her one last chance to back out. "We continue," he said. Sarah nodded. No one disagreed. They reached the aid station at 15:35. It was a farmhouse that had been converted into a makeshift medical facility, a sturdy stone building that now bore the scars of war. Part of the roof had collapsed from artillery damage, leaving a gaping hole that let in snow and cold. Wounded soldiers were everywhere, inside and outside the building, some being tended by overwhelmed medics, others lying unattended on stretchers or blankets, their faces grey with pain and cold. The aid station's senior medical officer, Captain Thomas Warren, met them with visible relief that bordered on desperation. "Thank God you're here," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have 237 wounded and we're completely overwhelmed. We've been under intermittent fire for 6 hours. 3 of my medics are wounded. We're out of plasma, low on morphine, and I've got men dying because we can't get to them fast enough." Sarah didn't wait for instructions or assignments. She immediately began organizing triage areas, moving through the chaos with calm authority, separating the critically wounded from those who could wait, setting up a system to track who'd been seen and who still needed attention. Patricia and Helen followed her lead, setting up a surgical area in the farmhouse's main room, working around the damaged roof, hanging blankets to provide some privacy and warmth. The medics began distributing supplies, their movements becoming more organized as Sarah's system took effect. Major Henshaw assessed the most critical cases and started planning the surgical order, determining who needed immediate intervention to survive. Within 30 minutes, they had transformed chaos into organized emergency medicine. What had been a scene of desperate confusion became a functioning medical operation. Sarah moved through the wounded soldiers with calm efficiency, making rapid assessments, delegating tasks, ensuring no one was overlooked. Many of the soldiers stared at her in surprise when they first saw her. Some made comments, usually variations of "I didn't know colored nurses were allowed this close to the front," or "I've never seen a colored officer before." Sarah ignored them completely, focused entirely on the work. Her hands moved constantly, checking pulses, examining wounds, adjusting bandages, starting plasma lines for those suffering from blood loss. The first surgery was a corporal with a collapsed lung, his breathing labored and shallow. Henshaw worked with intense concentration while Sarah assisted, anticipating every need, her hands steady despite the primitive conditions. They had to work fast because the surgical area was exposed to the elements through the damaged roof, and the sound of small arms fire was growing closer with each passing hour. The corporal survived, his breathing easing as Henshaw reinflated the lung and sealed the wound. Then came a sergeant with abdominal wounds, his intestines damaged by shrapnel, requiring delicate work to repair. Then a lieutenant with severe burns across his chest and arms, the flesh angry red and weeping. Then a private with multiple fractures, bones broken in ways that made Sarah wince. The surgeries blurred together, each one a fight against time and injury and the limitations of field medicine. Around 1700 hours, as the winter darkness began to fall early, the situation deteriorated sharply. Sergeant Riley burst into the farmhouse, his rifle in his hands, his expression grim. "German patrol approaching from the west," he said urgently. "Approximately 1 kilometer out. Maybe 15 to 20 soldiers. We need to evacuate now, sir. We can't defend this position against a determined attack." Henshaw looked up from the surgical table where he was working on a major with internal bleeding, his hands inside the man's abdomen. "This man will die if I stop now," he said flatly. "He's bleeding internally. And if I don't repair these vessels in the next 10 minutes, he won't make it." Riley's face was grim, the face of a man who'd seen combat and knew what was coming. "Sir, with respect, we might all die if we don't leave. We're badly outnumbered, and this building isn't defensible." Sarah spoke up, her voice calm despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Sergeant, how long can you hold them?" Riley considered, his eyes calculating. "Maybe 30 minutes if we're lucky and they're cautious, 20 if they're aggressive." Sarah looked at Henshaw, saw the concentration on his face, the steadiness of his hands. "How long do you need, Major?" 20 minutes, Henshaw replied without looking up from the surgery. "Give me 20 minutes and this man lives." Sarah turned back to Riley, meeting his eyes directly. "Then hold them for 20 minutes, Sergeant. Do whatever you have to do." What followed were the longest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. She could hear gunfire outside, close enough that she could distinguish individual weapons, could tell the difference between American rifles and German ones. The building shuddered occasionally from nearby explosions, probably grenades or mortar rounds. Dust and plaster rained down from the damaged ceiling, but inside in the surgical area, the work continued with eerie calm. Henshaw's hands never shook, his voice never wavered, his focus never broke. Sarah matched his composure, maintaining perfect focus despite the chaos outside, despite the fear that wanted to overwhelm her. When they finally closed the incision, and the Major's vital signs stabilized, when the surgery was complete and successful, Sarah allowed herself one long breath. Then it was time to move, time to get everyone out before the German patrol overwhelmed their thin defensive line. The evacuation was nightmarish in its complexity and urgency. They had to transport 237 wounded men, many on stretchers, through a combat zone in the gathering darkness. The infantry squad provided covering fire, while medics and nurses loaded the ambulances and trucks, working with desperate speed. Sarah coordinated the loading, ensuring the most critical patients were secured first. making rapid decisions about who could walk and who needed to be carried. Patricia and Helen worked alongside her, all three nurses moving with synchronized efficiency, three parts of one organism dedicated to saving lives. They managed to load about 60 patients into the vehicles before Sergeant Riley shouted another warning, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They're flanking us from the north," he yelled. "We need to go now, right now." But there were still nearly 200 soldiers who couldn't fit in the vehicles, soldiers who would be left behind if they abandoned the position. Henshaw made the agonizing decision that seemed like the only option. "We take the critical cases now and come back for the others," he said, his face tight with stress. "It's the only way." Sarah shook her head, refusing to accept it. "By the time we get back, the position will be overrun," she said. "These men will be prisoners at best, dead at worst. We need another solution." She turned to Captain Warren, desperate for options. "Is there anywhere nearby we can move the remaining wounded? Somewhere more defensible than this farmhouse?" Warren thought quickly, his mind racing through the local terrain. "There's a stone church about 2 kilometers south," he said. "Old building, really solid construction. It sits on higher ground and has thick walls. Better defensive position than this." Sarah looked at Henshaw, her mind already planning. "We move them on foot," she said. "Use the ambulances to carry the ones who absolutely can't walk. Make multiple trips if we have to." Henshaw stared at her like she'd suggested something impossible. "That's insane," he said. "We'll be completely exposed. Moving that many wounded through a combat zone on foot." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "You have a better idea, sir, because I don't. They didn't have a better idea. So they executed Sarah's plan, desperate and dangerous as it was. The ambulances took the most critical cases and departed immediately, racing through the darkness toward the relative safety of the field hospital. The remaining wounded who could walk, roughly 150 soldiers, were organized into groups. Sarah, Patricia, Helen, the 4 medics and several walking wounded who could still carry weapons began the trek to the church. It was barely 1800 hours, but in December that meant near darkness, the world reduced to shadows and snow and the distant flash of artillery. Halfway to the church, maybe 1 kilometer into the journey, they encountered a German patrol. The meeting was almost accidental, both groups emerging from tree lines at the same moment, maybe 50 meters apart across a snow-covered field. For a frozen instant that seemed to last forever, everyone stared at each other in mutual surprise. Then Sergeant Riley, who'd insisted on staying with the column despite orders to evacuate with the ambulances, opened fire. The German soldiers dove for cover and returned fire, and suddenly the night exploded with muzzle flashes and the crack of rifles. Sarah threw herself down into the snow, pulling 2 wounded soldiers with her, trying to make herself small. Bullets snapped through the air above their heads, that distinctive sound like fabric tearing. The firefight was brief but intense, maybe 3 or 4 minutes that felt like hours. Riley and the few armed soldiers held off the Germans long enough for the column to begin moving again, faster now despite the wounded struggling to keep up. Sarah ran along the line, helping soldiers who'd fallen, physically supporting those who couldn't maintain the pace, her voice urgent and encouraging. A young private, his leg badly wounded and wrapped in bloody bandages, collapsed in the snow halfway across the field. "Can't make it, ma'am," he gasped, his face twisted with pain and exhaustion. Sarah grabbed him under the arms without hesitation. "Yes, you can," she said fiercely. "You absolutely can." She half-dragged, half-carried him forward, her strength fueled by pure adrenaline and determination. Other soldiers saw her and helped, creating a chain of support. Wounded helping wounded, everyone pushing toward safety. They reached the church at 1845, all of them. Every single wounded soldier made it. The church was indeed more defensible, with thick stone walls and a clear view of the approaches, built centuries ago to last. Sarah immediately set up a new triage system inside, working by candlelight, since they didn't dare show brighter lights that might attract attention. Major Henshaw arrived with the first ambulance run at 1900 hours, having unloaded his previous passengers and raced back. He looked at Sarah, surrounded by wounded soldiers she'd somehow shepherded through enemy fire, and shook his head in disbelief and admiration. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly. "The absolute bravest." But there was no time for reflection or celebration. The ambulances made 4 more runs through the night, each one a nerve-wracking journey through contested territory where every shadow might hide enemy soldiers. Sarah coordinated everything with tireless efficiency, tracking which patients had been evacuated, ensuring the most critical cases went first, maintaining organization despite exhaustion and fear. Between evacuation runs, she performed triage, assisted with emergency procedures when soldiers' conditions deteriorated, and kept morale up among the wounded who had to wait their turn. She moved through the church like a force of nature, her presence calming and organizing and saving. By 0300 hours on December 21st, they'd evacuated 193 of the 237 wounded soldiers. Only the final group remained, 44 men who were waiting for the last ambulance run, their faces drawn with exhaustion and pain and the strain of waiting. Sarah was beyond exhaustion at this point, operating on willpower alone, her body running on fumes and determination and something deeper than physical strength. She sat on the cold stone floor next to a sergeant who'd lost both legs, keeping him talking to prevent him from going into shock, her hand warm in his cold one, her voice gentle and steady. He was from Georgia, and he told her about his wife and 2 daughters waiting for him back home. Used to think a lot of things about colored folks, he said, his voice weak and thready. My daddy raised me a certain way, taught me that white folks and colored folks were just different, that's all. Separate but equal, you know. Guess I was wrong about most of it. Guess my daddy was wrong too. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. You're going to see your daughters again, Sergeant, she promised. I guarantee it. You're going to go home and tell them about tonight. At 0330, they heard vehicles approaching through the darkness. Everyone tensed, weapons rising, but it was the ambulances returning for the final run. Sarah helped load the last patients, including the sergeant from Georgia, securing him carefully in the ambulance. As she was checking his straps one final time, he grabbed her hand with surprising strength. Thank you, Mom, he said, his eyes wet. For everything you did tonight, for not giving up on us. Sarah nodded, too tired for words, too emotional to trust her voice. The final convoy reached the field hospital at 0445, just as the first grey light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky. Captain Bradford was waiting at the entrance, and his relief was visible on his face. When the final count was completed, when they'd checked and rechecked the numbers, the results were remarkable. Of the 237 soldiers at the aid station, 231 had been successfully evacuated. 6 had died before the medical team arrived, their wounds too severe to survive. But every single soldier who was alive when Sarah and her team reached them was still alive when they returned to the field hospital. A 100% survival rate under combat conditions, under fire, in contested territory. It was unprecedented. Sarah stumbled to her tent and collapsed on her cot, still in her blood-stained uniform, too exhausted to even remove her boots. She slept for 14 straight hours, a deep, dreamless sleep of utter exhaustion. When she woke, the camp had changed in subtle but profound ways. Soldiers she didn't know stopped to salute her as she walked to the mess tent. Medics asked her for advice on procedures, treating her words like gospel. Captain Henderson requested a private meeting, where she formally apologized for underutilizing Sarah's skills, her words stiff but seemingly sincere. Major Henshaw submitted a recommendation for the Bronze Star, writing that Lieutenant Coleman had displayed extraordinary courage and medical expertise that directly resulted in saving over 200 lives. But the most significant change was the one Sarah saw in the eyes of the other nurses, particularly in Ruth Barker's eyes. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something that looked like respect, maybe even admiration. Ruth approached Sarah in the mess tent a few days after the mission, her face serious. I was wrong about you, she said simply, no defensiveness in her voice. I was wrong about a lot of things, actually. I'm sorry for the things I said. Sarah accepted the apology with grace, understanding that this moment was bigger than personal grievance. We all have things to learn, she replied. All of us. The war teaches us if we're willing to listen. Over the following weeks, as the German offensive was slowly contained and then reversed through fierce fighting and massive Allied counterattacks, Sarah became the hospital's lead surgical nurse. She trained other nurses in advanced trauma techniques, sharing everything she'd learned. She organized more efficient triage systems that other field hospitals began adopting. She assisted Major Henshaw in dozens of complex surgeries, the two of them developing a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared excellence. The hospital's survival rates improved markedly, and other medical units began requesting transfers to the 77th Field Hospital, specifically to learn from their methods. In February of 1945, at a formal ceremony attended by officers from multiple units, Sarah received the Bronze Star for valor. The citation read, "For heroic achievement in connection with military operations against the enemy." Lieutenant Sarah May Coleman displayed extraordinary courage and medical expertise while operating in a hostile fire zone, leading the successful evacuation and treatment of over 200 wounded soldiers. Under direct enemy fire and in extreme conditions, Lieutenant Coleman maintained exemplary composure and medical competence. Her actions directly resulted in saving numerous lives under the most hazardous conditions. Her performance reflects great credit upon herself and the United States Army Nurse Corps. But Sarah never kept the medal in a prominent place. She packed it away in her footlocker, and later, when she returned home, in a drawer in her bedroom. Instead, she kept letters from soldiers she'd treated, from families thanking her, from other black nurses who'd heard her story, and felt inspired to push harder against their own barriers, to demand the respect they deserved. One letter from the sergeant from Georgia was particularly meaningful. "My daughters ask about you all the time," he wrote in careful handwriting. "I tell them about the nurse who carried me through the snow when I couldn't walk, who promised I'd see them again and kept that promise like it was a sacred vow. I tell them that courage and kindness don't have a color. They're just human qualities, and the best humans have them in abundance. Thank you for teaching an old fool a lesson he should have learned years ago. I'm a better man now, and my daughters will grow up better because of what you taught me." The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, with Germany's surrender bringing relief and joy to millions. Sarah served until September, then returned to the United States, sailing back across the Atlantic to a country that had changed but not enough, that celebrated its victory while maintaining the same old divisions. She faced new battles there, fighting segregation in civilian hospitals, working to integrate medical institutions, mentoring young black nurses, and showing them that excellence could overcome barriers. The fight was harder in some ways than anything she'd faced in Belgium, because the violence was bureaucratic rather than explosive, death by 1,000 small exclusions rather than artillery fire. But Sarah had learned something crucial in that farmhouse and that church, and that desperate trek through the snow. Excellence could not be denied forever. Courage could not be dismissed indefinitely. And when someone proves their worth under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, it becomes harder to maintain the comfortable fictions that prejudice requires. In 1953, Sarah was appointed head of nursing at a major hospital in Chicago, the first black woman to hold such a position in that city. There was resistance, of course, letters of complaint, threats of resignation from some staff members, patients who refused treatment from a hospital led by a colored nurse. But Sarah had faced German patrols under fire. She'd carried wounded soldiers through combat zones. Bureaucratic resistance seemed trivial by comparison. In 1968, she established a scholarship fund for black nursing students, using money she'd saved over the years combined with donations from veterans she'd treated and their families. The fund helped hundreds of young women pursue nursing careers who might not have had the opportunity otherwise. In 1975, she published a memoir titled Healing Under Fire, which became required reading in nursing programs across the country. The book was honest about the discrimination she'd faced, unflinching in its depiction of military segregation, but also hopeful about the possibility of change through excellence and perseverance. Major Robert Henshaw remained a close friend for the rest of his life. They corresponded regularly, long letters discussing medicine and life, and the changes they were seeing in American society. He never missed an opportunity to tell people about the nurse who'd volunteered for a mission that terrified everyone, who'd marched 200 wounded soldiers through enemy fire, who'd proven beyond any doubt that healing hands were just healing hands, regardless of their color. "The best nurse I ever worked with," he'd say to anyone who would listen, and I worked with hundreds during my career. The absolute best. Sarah May Coleman died in 1998 at the age of 82, peacefully in her sleep after a life fully lived. Her funeral was attended by over 500 people, including 36 veterans she'd treated during the war, now elderly men themselves. One of them, the private she'd carried through the snow to the church, gave a eulogy that left barely a dry eye in the building. "She saved my life twice," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Once by stopping my bleeding and getting me to safety when I thought I was going to die in that farmhouse. And once by showing me that the prejudices I'd grown up with were lies, comfortable lies that made me feel superior without earning it. The first saved my body. The second saved my soul. I owe her everything I became after that night." The story of Sarah May Coleman's mission behind enemy lines became part of Army Nurse Corps history, taught as an example of courage under fire and medical excellence in extreme conditions. But it's also a story about something larger, something more profound than individual bravery. It's about a moment when one person's extraordinary competence and courage made denial impossible, when the fiction of racial inferiority met the fact of racial equality and shattered like glass. 200 soldiers survived because Sarah Coleman was willing to go where others feared to tread, because she refused to accept that her race disqualified her from serving at the highest level. But countless more people, black and white, had their lives changed, because she proved something that should never have needed proving in the first place. That dedication, skill, and courage are human qualities, not racial ones. That healing is colorblind. That excellence, when given the chance to demonstrate itself, cannot be ignored or dismissed. The field hospital in Belgium was decommissioned in 1946, its tents packed away, its personnel scattered to other assignments or sent home. The farmhouse where the aid station had been was rebuilt by its owners and became a family home again, children playing in the yard where wounded soldiers had once lain. The church where Sarah organized that final desperate triage still stands today. A small stone building in the Belgian countryside. A small plaque on its wall, installed in 1992, tells the story in English and French of the night when an American nurse led 200 wounded soldiers to safety. Local historians say that every year, a few American veterans or their families make the pilgrimage to that church, to stand where Sarah stood, to remember what she did, to honor her courage. History is full of moments when individuals rise above the limitations placed on them by society, when someone says no to injustice and yes to their own capabilities. Sarah May Coleman's story is one of those moments, made more remarkable by the fact that she did it while bullets were flying and men were dying, while facing prejudice from the very people she was risking her life to save. She didn't let their doubts become her limits. She didn't let their fears diminish her courage. She simply did what she was trained to do, what she was called to do, with such undeniable excellence that the barriers fell away like snow melting in spring sunshine. In the end, what Sarah proved in those desperate December days of 1944 was simple but profound. When someone shows up, does the work, saves the lives, and never wavers in the face of danger or doubt, the only rational response is respect. Everything else is just noise, just the sound of prejudice dying its slow, inevitable death. The wounded soldiers who survived because of her didn't care about the color of her skin as she sutured their wounds and kept them alive through the endless night. The surgeons who worked beside her didn't care about her race when her steady hands made the difference between success and failure. The medics she trained didn't care about prejudice when they were learning techniques that would save lives. In the crucible of crisis, truth emerges stark and clear. And the truth that emerged from Sarah Coleman's story was that she was exactly what she'd always claimed to be, an exceptional nurse, a brave soldier, and a human being worthy of every opportunity and respect that any other person deserved. 200 soldiers lived because she refused to be limited by other people's limitations, and in saving them, she helped save something else, something bigger and more important. The possibility that America might someday live up to its own stated ideals of equality and opportunity for all. That's a legacy that matters. That's a story worth remembering and retelling, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.